Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Sports and Society Dialogues, an initiative of the Sports Law and Policy Center in collaboration with the BIC, where we explore issues at the intersection of sports, law and policy, and society. Today's topic is on transgender athletes and participation, exploring gender, fairness, and inclusion in sport. I'm excited to introduce you to our speakers for this evening. We have Ms. Joanna Harper, Visiting Fellow for Transgender Athletic Performance at Loughborough University in England, a PhD researcher and a PhD researcher at the university, where she is undertaking 3 studies on the performance of transgender athletes. Ms. Harper has authored or co-authored several books and papers on concerning transgender and intersex athletes. She works closely with several international and national sports governing bodies as they grapple with the complex issues surrounding the eligibility policy for transgender and intersex athletes, including the IOC, World Athletics, and the World Rowing. She also speaks frequently at national meetings and symposia on the topics of transgender and intersex athletes. Ms. Harper's interest on the topic of transgender athletic performance grew out of her own gender transition and the subsequent speed loss that she encountered as a sub-elite distance runner. Prior to her late life career change, Ms. Harper has a master's degree in medical physics and has worked for several years as a medical physicist. We have Dr. Seema Patel, who is a senior lecturer of law at the Nottingham Law School at the Nottingham Trent University. Her research field is sports law with a specific focus on discrimination and the regulatory balance between inclusion and exclusion in competitive sport. Dr. Patel is an international expert on gender discrimination in sport, where she has offered extensive media commentary on the legal implications of gender eligibility rules and has also contributed to government consultation on the inclusion and participation in sport. Her recent academic publications examine the regulatory gaps in the protection of athletes' human rights in sport. Our moderator for the evening is Bhavya Dore, who's a freelance journalist writing for various publications in India and abroad. She's written on culture, sports, law, and gender, and her work has appeared in the BBC, The Wired, ESPN, Al Jazeera, Religion News Service, and other places. A recent story she wrote for the Mint Lounge newspaper on India's transgender athletes won a Lico Award for LGBT-related reporting. She's also received awards for her reporting on child labor, science, and technology sports. Welcome to all our speakers. Before we begin, if any of our viewers have any questions during the session, please type them in the question box on your Zoom toolbar, and our speakers will try to address some of your questions during the session or at the end of it. I would now like to hand it over to Bhavya to take forward this discussion.
Thank you, Yogita, and thanks to the Bangalore International Center as well as the Sports Law and Policy Center for doing this, and welcome and thank you to our speakers today, both Seema and Joanna, both based in the UK. I guess this is quite a week to be looking at this subject of transgender athletes and inclusion and fairness and all of these subjects related to competitive sport, given some of the developments in the past week in terms of sports bodies changing their policies or amending or tightening existing rules. But before we go into some of the more recent developments, maybe it's worthwhile to look at how some of these policies have evolved, have been brought in. And of course, Seema will come at it from a legal and a sports law perspective, whereas Joanna has been studying this in terms of performance and the research she's been doing in how what the science says about transgender athletes and transitioning. So I think the scope of this debate will be mostly restricted to transgender athletes in the sense that we'll be looking at people who transition either from male to female or female to male, but I guess inevitably we'd also end up touching upon cases like caster-semenya or athletes with DSDs or differences in sexual development. So if I can just begin by asking you, Joanna, you talk about it in your book. What is the way in which the category of women's sport has itself evolved, and what are the different ways it's been policed, or how have sports authorities tried to ensure that women are indeed women who are competing?
There really wasn't much women's sports before 1930, but in the 1930s, there started to be a realization that there needed to be a separate category for female sports. And at the time, governing bodies like World Athletics and the IOC fairly quickly began to realize that not everyone falls neatly into the male and female categories. The early attempts at trying to define exactly who should qualify for the female category in sport were mostly centered on intersex or DSD athletes. But since we're talking about transgender athletes, we should probably skip forward to the 1970s when Renee Richards became the first transgender athlete to compete. At the time, there was a test in place designed to make sure that everyone who was female was female. It's called the Bar Body test, and it tested to see if a person had two X chromosomes. The assumption was that everybody was either XX or XY. Renee declined to take this test. She's undoubtedly XY as she was assigned male at birth, and instead went to the legal courts, which did grant her the right to play. Things evolved. In 2004, the IOC first formally allowed transgender athletes to compete. And at that time, they specified that any trans woman who would compete in the female division had to have gonadectomy or genital surgery, had to have 2 years of post-surgical hormones, and had to have completed all legal changes. There are some problems with all three of those, and in 2016, the IOC updated their policy saying that trans women only needed 1 year of hormone therapy to bring testosterone below 10 nanomoles per liter. The IOC in 2021 later came up with a framework saying that there were not necessarily that each sport would decide on its own, but within the framework, the IOC suggested there be no restrictions until there be robust peer-reviewed evidence. World Athletics is another governing body that was important, and up until 2019, the two bodies were fairly close together in their policies. World Athletics formally had a 2011 and then a 2019 transgender policy. The 2011 policy required 10 nanomoles per liter as the limit. The 2019 policy had reduced that to 5 nanomoles per liter. World Athletics and a number of other governing bodies in the wake of the IOC's 2021 policy suggesting that each governing body set their own policy, has been looking at their policy and trying to determine what they will do. There also have been a number of high-profile cases in the last few years that have caused individual sporting bodies to introduce their own policy. How's that for 90 years in a very few minutes?
Well done. Seema, if I can just ask you, you've also seen all these changes in the past 2 decades. Can you talk a little bit about the shortcomings or what has been achieved with the latest IOC policy and how the changes have evolved and what you see as good or bad about what's coming in the latest round?
Sure, yes. So I can, I guess, add a bit to what Joanna's outlined there. Obviously, when I started researching this 20 years ago, it was very hypothetical, a very kind of rare situation. And the only legal case we had, as Joanna's mentioned, was the Renee Richards case. So she brought a legal case to fight for her inclusion into the sport. And yes, over the years, as Joanna's outlined as well, we've seen the methods used to determine femininity evolve and develop, beginning with very humiliating and draconian testing methods. And whilst there was then kind of an outlaw or prohibition of sex testing, I guess it's morphed or evolved into these policies and eligibility rules. one of the issues, the tensions at the moment, really is on the science and the foundation for excluding or banning trans athletes from competing. So the governing bodies are now trying to identify what the scientific basis is for their inclusion and exclusion. And last year, the IOC brought out an updated guidance, the framework for inclusion, and they, for the first time, actually flipped the lens to focus on inclusion and recognition of human rights first. And that received a lot of criticism from the field, with many saying that human rights doesn't come into it and it's all about performance and science. So it's created quite a tense debate. And as Joanna said, there's been a lot of recent athletes as well who've been thrown into the spotlight because they've been banned from competing. And as I've mentioned in comments in the media, it's created a really polarized and heated and dangerous situation, I think, for those gender diverse athletes. So we have a situation now where governing bodies are this domino effect is happening, and they're releasing their policies and eligibility rules, which appear to be banning trans athletes. So I guess the real key debate, and Joanna's been a part of that as well in the media recently, is whether science is a basis for that, whether it is fair, whether the evidence is conclusive that there's a performance advantage or not, or whether, you know, it's unfair and it's a breach of their human rights. I think Seb Khoury said the other day, if he had to choose between fairness and inclusion, he chooses fairness. And my response to that was, well, why are they being treated separately? To me, fairness and inclusion should kind of come hand in hand. I don't know why they've been opposed. So yeah, from a legal point of view, this really is, I think, a human rights matter, and there isn't enough focus on human rights in these eligibility policies. It has been mostly founded upon the science, and yes, there is progress because the governing bodies are taking part in consultations, and Joanna's been a key part of those, and they are listening to the views of other parties involved in all of this, but I'm not sure to what extent those views have been taken into consideration for the final kind of formalization of those policies.
So since you mentioned science and Joanna's work, Joanna, can you tell the audience a little bit about the work that you're doing, to the extent that you can, the studies that you've done so far, and how you started by looking at timings of women before and after transition, and what kind of advice you've been giving various governing bodies on this in terms of the science?
Well, in truth, the science is in its infancy. I guess immodestly, I would say it began with me. When I underwent my gender transition in 2004, I'm a fairly serious distance runner, and within 9 months of starting hormone therapy, I was running 12% slower, and that's the difference between serious male and serious female distance runners. So as a scientist, I was intrigued, and I set out to learn more about the endocrinology and the exercise physiology involved. My background previously was in medical physics, which is the application of physics principles to the high-tech modern world of medicine. And it's not an academic, but a professional degree. But I was intrigued by this, and so I set out to learn more about areas I didn't know, and I also gathered data from 8 transgender distance runners over time, and as you said, collected race times before and after transition, using a well-known metric used by World Masters Athletics, that collectively the 8 women were no more competitive in the women's category than they had been in the men's category. That was published in 2015. And in 2019, I left my job in the healthcare sector to take up research full-time at Loughborough University. There we have 3 studies going. We have a longitudinal lab study where we try to get transgender athletes into the sports labs before they start hormone therapy. We measure their size, strength, speed, stamina, get blood values, muscle biopsies, pictures of the heart, that sort of thing, and repeat those tests for up every 3 months after the athlete starts hormone therapy for up to 2 years. Our second study is a cross-sectional lab study where we get trans women athletes into the lab who've already been on hormone therapy and are participating in women's sports. Again, we measure their size, strength, speed, stamina, and get blood values, but we only do that one time, and we compare that to a matched group of cisgender or typical women. The third study is an online observational study, and it's an extension of my original study, where beyond just distance runners, we look at performances before and after in sports like athletics or weightlifting or swimming, where it's easy to do make comparisons. So that's what we're doing at Loughborough University, but it's still very, very early stages, and there won't be robust peer-reviewed evidence until there are more centers in more countries doing similar sorts of research. So the research on trans athletes is in its infancy. There is no doubt that trans women will maintain some advantages even after hormone therapy, but trans women will also have physiological disadvantages induced. Their larger frames are now being powered by reduced muscle mass and reduced aerobic capacity, and that can lead to disadvantages in things like quickness, recovery, endurance. Trans women also have a tendency to put on weight, which is disadvantageous in many sports. Beyond the physiology, trans women also have some sociological and psychological challenges that will also affect their performance. So just saying that trans women maintain advantages is not enough. And because there's this complex interaction of advantages and disadvantages, it's necessary to get detailed data from trans athletes to do the science right. And as I say, that's in its infancy. And there's no conclusive evidence to say, too much right now. And I've probably talked enough. So how about if I turn that over?
So also it would vary from sport to sport, right? Endurance versus non-endurance sports, and skills and hand-eye coordination, all those things are variable across sports. So, but you looked extensively at the role of testosterone as well in all of this, and where does that fit in? And how does hormone therapy play a role in this entire debate?
So testosterone is of key importance. If we are differentiating male athletes from female athletes, when male people go through puberty, their testosterone shoots up to by a factor of approximately 20. And this has profound effects on things like muscle size, strength, height, bone density, hemoglobin values. When trans women go through male puberty, unless they've gone on blockers beforehand, they will have the same sort of effects, even though trans women don't want these effects. But then when trans women go on hormone therapy, some things will be reversed, some things will be partially reversed, and some things won't change at all. Hemoglobin is an example of something that's completely reversed. Within 3 to 4 months of hormone therapy, hemoglobin values will go from typical male to typical female values, and hemoglobin is the single most important factor in endurance events. Again, all sports are multifactorial. You can't just put, you can't say just one thing. It's not hemoglobin, it's not testosterone, but in endurance, hemoglobin is the single most important. So that changes completely. Strength changes partially. Trans women will lose strength, but won't go from typical male to typical female values. Exactly how much remaining strength advantage transgender women have is uncertain at this point, and definitely needs to be more research. The third category are things that change at all, or very little, things like height. If a trans woman has reached full adult height, going on hormone therapy won't markedly decrease that height. And height is an advantage in things like volleyball and basketball, but a disadvantage in sports like gymnastics. So yes, all of these factors come into play, but they do vary from sport to sport. And until we have sport-specific, athlete-centric data on trans athletes, it's really hard to draw firm conclusions.
Seema, to come back to you, we know that there's not enough data, there's not enough conclusive studies. So in the absence of those, should we wait and watch and not allow trans women into women's sport until there's conclusive data, or err on the side of inclusion? Which way?
Well, from my perspective, it's always going to be that you include, until that evidence is there. But there is to play a bit of a devil's advocate here, there's a so what element to this as well. Society developing, progressing and evolving, and our understanding of gender identity is massively shifted, and there are increasing calls for gender legal status reforms that recognize and acknowledge the diversity in gender identity. So if society has shifted and there is legal recognition for a much broader understanding of gender, then pockets of society or industry such as sport are going to have to catch up, and they're also going to have to open their doors to that difference now. And so there is a question of, to what extent sport will accept gender diversity rather than pushing for these binary linear divisions and distinctions between men and women, as the understanding of woman and man really is evolving in broader society. And so there is that perspective to consider here as well. So from a pure human rights perspective, yes, absolutely, these individuals should be included, regardless of the science. And again, I know that's controversial, but there is that opinion to consider here, because these individuals have human rights. They are not just athletes, they're human beings, and just like all of us, they should be guaranteed protection from discrimination and mistreatment in any area of life. Just because they're an athlete doesn't mean they should give up those rights completely. And so what's been ignored, I think, in the debate is that perspective, which is really unfortunate, I think, because it imbalances the considerations that need to be made here. And it's very humiliating for the athletes themselves as well. What these athletes are going through in the media, in the public eye, is really quite unfortunate, quite horrific, to be honest with you. And I think that we as a society are forgetting that they are human beings at the end of the day.
I guess the counter to that would be the cis women athletes who oppose, say, Leah Thomas or Emily Bridges or any of the others who say that their rights are being trampled upon. I mean, it's a contestation of a woman's right versus the trans woman's right to participate. And so what would you say to that argument?
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And whenever I've discussed this, I'm not saying that trans athletes' rights, or gender diverse athletes' rights trump cis female rights, not at all, because all rights are equally important here. But I think I'm trying to figure out that perspective and where the fear or the threat is coming from, to what extent they feel that trans athletes are posing a threat. And I think there's a panic that's been created around that, because I don't think that threat is as large or intense as envisaged. But there is this panic that's been created around a trans athlete who used to be male coming into women's sports and taking over. But again, I don't think that's the case. I think I read about Leah Thomas that there were lots of accusations being made in the press about her breaking records, this, that, and the other. And actually, the journalists had to retract their statements on that, because they simply weren't true, that she was breaking all these records. Yes, she was doing well, but she was not completely smashing swimming stats and data. So there are these assumptions that are being made that are actually sometimes false and becoming very dangerous. And that's what I think is happening. This has been thrown into the public eye, and the average Joe blog doesn't really have an informed position on this. And so we have these opinions flying around social media that are really quite derogatory. And I think that's creating a lot of difficulty in this debate.
Question to both of you. We see this discussion mostly when it comes to trans women, but not so much when it comes to trans men. Is it because there are fewer athletes, or they're not perceived as much of a threat? Or what would you say?
I'll go first. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Joanna.
No, go.
Okay. No, I was just going to say that I think it's back to this idea of back to the masculinity and the idea that a male has a superiority in sport, and there is an advantage issue if a male transitions to a female. Whereas I don't believe, again, Joanna will probably comment on the science, I don't believe there is obviously that threat, perceived threat, if a female transitions to a male. And then some of the policies talk about safety risks and injury risks and that kind of thing, and there isn't, that it's not perceived that there are those issues from female to male.
Yeah, I agree totally. There's not this perceived risk. Now, trans men or female to male transgender people do get to inject testosterone, and no other athlete is allowed to legally inject testosterone. And there have been some people who have complained about that. Certainly, the highest profile cases have been trans women, but there are some trans men who have been successful in men's sports. But it just hasn't created the controversy, and it's not likely to in the near future either.
And it's the same, isn't it, Joanna, for athletes with sex variations? I don't know if intersex is the term we want to use in this discussion, but the intersex variations are far and wide and so diverse, but the challenges are around those variations that have the women that have elevated levels of testosterone. But actually those variations occur in men as well, don't they? There's a number of different variations that exist, but the focus or the exclusion has been on those particular women who have elevated testosterone levels or male chromosomes.
There are a wide variety of intersex conditions or variations of sex conditions, whatever term we prefer to use. I'm quite neutral on terms here, but some of them affect both XY babies and XX babies. Some of them only affect one and some the other. We are talking about trans here, but the science of intersex conditions in itself is extremely complicated.
Isn't it the case that the IOC did a bunch of studies or looked at some of the data? You've talked about this previously, where women with DSTs were overrepresented on the podium. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Or in certain events, is that right?
So there are only 2 sports in the world where there is this huge overrepresentation of women with sex variations. And those sports are football and athletics. There are a number of reasons for that, but I won't really go into all of them. But so those are the only 2 sports really that face this issue of overrepresentation. And they have certainly looked at this very differently. In certain events in athletics, primarily the 400 and 800 meters, there has over the last 30 years been a fairly incredible overrepresentation of of intersex women at elite levels in those sports, and that has triggered World Athletics to to look very closely at what they do. As in the 90s, both World Athletics and the IOC abandoned chromosome testing, but it was 13 years ago that that World Athletics was forced to take a much closer look at this, and so there are these areas of middle distance where intersex women have been hugely overrepresented. It's kind of interesting in football. There are countries where the national football team is hugely overrepresented with intersex women, but it shows that testosterone is certainly not the only thing that matters. But those aren't the countries that are most successful in football, and so FIFA, the world governing body. Well, if they're not really winning anything internationally, they don't care, right? And so, but on a national level, there are countries where the representation of women with sex variations is fairly enormous. But again, those countries aren't winning the World Cup or even making the final 8 in the World Cup. And so, FIFA's kind of said, yeah, whatever. Whereas World Athletics has become very engaged in how to deal with these women.
Is it also a question of when it's an individual sport, you see the individual shining, or you see the individual results versus them getting lost in a team sport in a broader?
Of course, that's true.
In terms of, say, sports bodies, question for both of you that have started taking this on since the 2021 IOC policy. Who has been doing what, and what have you seen that's work, that's to your liking, that's not, that needs more work?
I'll go first then. Yeah, I think it's been before that. I think it happened before COVID. This started, didn't it? I think the Seema illegal challenge. That's why it's hard to talk about these very separately, because they are connected. And I think because of the Seema challenge, the duty charm challenge, this forced governing bodies to think about their policies in this area a little bit more, I think. So Joanna and I were part of the World Rugby consultation, and Joanna, they were the first world governing body to engage in this consultation, weren't they?
No, they weren't. They promoted it, but actually both the IOC and World Athletics started doing very similar consultations starting around 1990. They just didn't publicize it. They didn't tell anyone about it. But World Rugby in 2020 invited both of us and a number of other people and trumpeted it and said, look what we're doing. Whereas the World Athletics and IOC had been doing it for 30 years. They just didn't talk about it.
Right, yes, of course. And they were getting it wrong as well throughout those years.
Well, I would suggest that World Rugby got it wrong too.
Yeah, no, yes, I was going to say that, yeah. I guess what I mean is since the Seema case and since the legal challenge, they were kind of one of the first to say, oh, okay, we'll review our policy by engaging this open consultation. So my view on that was that was really positive in terms of the process, because it was, for me, from my understanding, one of the first times since the challenges have been brought forward, that they did invite people from different areas, different disciplines, different expertise, including athletes themselves, to come and have this, what we thought was a very open discussion about the issues and considerations that needed to be made. Unfortunately, personally, I don't agree with what they came out with, which was to ban the athletes. I don't believe our discussion reflected that per se. So that was really unfortunate, but I do believe in the process. I think that was really positive, and I think that definitely demonstrates a little bit of progress in terms of attempting to hear voices from different perspectives. So in that regard, I think, from my understanding of FINA as well, they engaged in a consultation, and I think they divided up the groups into athlete, science, legal and human rights from my reading of the report. I don't really know to what extent those groups spoke, though. I don't know if they were kept separate in different rooms or something. I hope they weren't. I hope they did engage in a more collaborative conversation. The report doesn't really reflect much of the discussion from the law and human rights group or the athletes group. It was, again, more about the science. But yeah, I believe the conversations are very positive. I just don't think they've been translated into the policies that have been drawn up. I don't know what your thoughts are, Joanna.
The reality is that this is a very, very difficult thing to get right. I mean, so when you say people get it wrong, there are things that change. Science changes with times. Our ideals of how we value individual rights versus the rights of groups. There are a number of things that change with time, and just because an organization changes its policy doesn't mean that they got it wrong before. It was just, perhaps less than ideal, and times change. However, where I think that the World Rugby thing is really unfortunate is that if you decide to make a ban of a group, and the World Rugby ban only applies to international level rugby, but even at lower levels, it has a very chilling effect on participation. I can tell you that in the UK, transgender participation in the sport of rugby has gone down by 3 or 4-fold, and not that there were huge numbers before, but most of the trans women who were participating in rugby before this decision, even though they're not banned because they don't compete internationally, have left the sport because they no longer feel they're welcome. And so while I have some sympathy for world governing bodies and the idea that they make a policy and then it turns out to be not ideal and they change it later, I don't think that's, it's certainly unfortunate in some individual cases where people have been treated poorly, but I think that's part of the process. But when you put in bans, then it has sort of a cementing process, and it does create this category of this climate, of exclusion to the great detriment of the people who are categorically excluded.
Wasn't one of the concerns though about safety? What would you say to that? Is that, exaggerated, the safety point that's been raised?
I think that it was exaggerated. Certainly, again, transgender women are on average taller, bigger, and stronger. And so there's a potential for a safety risk. But, World Rugby did not show that trans women injure cis women at any higher rate than cis women injure themselves. They didn't in any way measure what actually happens. They did a theoretical calculation based on assumptions about the size of trans women. And these are assumptions, not, again, they didn't even get the size of trans women who are in rugby. So they just made this theoretical calculation, said there's this increased risk, and this increased theoretical risk is too large. So yeah, I take huge issue with that. And the theoretical risk was based on a per tackle basis. And since no trans woman that we know of has played international level rugby, then the cumulative risk from all the tackles that trans women have made in international rugby is zero, because no tackles have been made. And in lower levels of sport, the percentage of tackles that are made by trans women are so small because of the participation numbers that, again, the cumulative risk, regardless of what the theoretical risk per tackle is infinitesimal, because there's just so few trans women making tackles. So yeah, calculating a theoretical per tackles increased risk, it looked good on paper, but I don't think it translates at all to the real world. And I think basing a ban on that is, I think it reflects very poorly on world rugby.
And then also, I think again, I'm not a scientist here, but my view on the risk situation was, well, what about all the other risks in sport? One of the biggest issues they're facing right now, rugby, is concussion, and other sports are also facing that. And so injury risk and well-being and welfare of athletes is part of a much wider debate. So there are a number of risks to consider within sport, and inherent risks that athletes consent to some extent, risks that athletes don't consent to and now are being dealt with, and legal challenges have been brought as a result of that. So yeah, I think when these ideas have been brought in and discussed, it's not necessarily always contextualized very well. And yeah, I agree with Joanna. I again, as a non-scientist, I don't think that was really explained so convincingly in the consultation, the idea of risk and injury. But I think other sports are mentioning that, aren't they, Joanna, in some of their policies and stuff, in this injury risk?
Yeah, some are, but I mean, obviously there's no increased safety risk in swimming.
No, but that's been discussed, hasn't it? I think they've discussed that. I'm sure they've discussed that in their policy, or it's been mentioned that there's a safety risk to other competitors, and I wasn't sure how that would work because it's not contact in any way.
They stay in separate lanes.
Yeah,
it's not. Yeah,
I did think that.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was just going to ask Joanna, with the FINA policy, Joanna, they've grouped DSD, as they call it, them, and trans athletes, haven't they?
Yes, although I am not aware that there has ever been a woman with sex variations compete at high level swimming at all. Even moderate high level swimming. There may have been, but I certainly am not aware of it ever happening in 90 years. So I don't know why they would even mention women with sex variations.
But from a scientific perspective, isn't that like there's different considerations as well to be made? So that's why I was surprised that they were grouped, that those groups were grouped together in one policy.
Yeah, I don't see them. There's no reason why swimming would have a policy on women with sex variations. I just, I don't know why they did that.
Interesting.
I was going to ask you, Seema, do you see athletes who've been excluded or banned mounting legal challenges? Is there room for that? And what happens if someone wants to challenge your governing body's policy?
Yeah, so this is a question that lots of people are asking me now. And all of this debate is part of a much wider discussion about the relationship between sport and the law that's not really come to public attention so much, I guess, because it might not be as interesting as the science, I don't know, but because the law operates in quite a private regulatory way, it's often being almost immune from legal intervention, so it gets to do whatever it likes, essentially, and that's especially the case when it comes to issues of discrimination. So unfortunately, athletes are in quite a vulnerable position as a result of that. So whereas in any line of work, if you were subject to a dispute or mistreatment, you could go to the law of the land or a tribunal and seek a legal remedy. Well, athletes struggle with that because in order to participate, they have to sign up to exclude exclusive arbitration agreements that say that if there's a dispute, they can only go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport to challenge their ruling or decision. So that limits their ability to access the courts for that legal remedy. And so I think it's going to be incredibly difficult, to be honest with you. Look at Seema, for instance. The challenges now with the European Court of Human Rights, but it's obviously impacted her career considerably to bring this case. And it's a real tall order when an athlete does bring a legal case, because they have to sacrifice a lot. So that there is currently in the academic world a lot of discussion about how sports are held much more accountable to legal provisions around human rights and non-discrimination, and how we get over this regulatory barrier that athletes face when they feel that they've been mistreated by sports bodies. So in short, at the moment, I think it'd be very difficult for athletes to bring that legal challenge, but perhaps not impossible, given the wider discussion that's taking place around that at the moment.
The swimming body also talked about a potential for an open category in the future. I don't know how feasible or logistically possible that would be, but is that something other sports are looking at, and would either of you, what would you say to that consideration?
There are people have sort of framed this open category in a couple of ways. Some people have suggested that you have a women's category and an open category, which would include men and everyone who might not fit in their idea of a female category. Swimming did something different. They have a men's category and a women's category and an open category. And some people have previously described that as a third category. But there are, quite frankly, simply not enough transgender swimmers, let alone transgender and intersex swimmers, to to have a sufficient pool, shall we say. I remain skeptical that they can make this category work feasible. I will withhold somewhat judgment till I see what develops. But I would ask, will the swimmers in the open category get to win Olympic medals? Will they get to earn professional sports contracts? And the answers are probably no to each of those, but let's see what happens. But if they aren't, if this open category is just treated like a sideshow, then then it's a disaster.
Yeah, I agree with Joanna that there wouldn't be enough athletes to form that category, I don't think. But also, if we think about it from a human rights perspective or equality perspective, male to female trans athletes identify with being female, not other. So from an identity point of view, I find that a little bit problematic as well. And I find it very problematic that these individuals are considered biologically male, such as the athletes with sex variations labelled biologically male, when I completely think that's a misjudgment, a misunderstanding of their identity completely. So to create an other category, it doesn't sit very comfortably with me at all, because I essentially, again, as I said, society accepts or is beginning to accept, and the law is supporting that idea that these individuals are female or male, and they should be recognised as so. So then to put them into a third category, if we're going to call it that, doesn't seem logical to me.
Okay, there are a couple of questions. I'm just going to read this one out from Shiraj. From a legislator's perspective, since physical ability in contact sports remains a main deterrent factor, obviously not the only, but quite significant. These include bone density, lung capacity, structure, height, and so on, more than beyond testosterone. How would you include transgender women in the sporting world while making it a level playing field at the same time?
So
whoever wants to take.
Did the question say from a legislator's point of view?
Yeah. Can you see it in the chat?
Oh, okay. I can.
How would you regulate? Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, from my point of view, again, I'm not the science expert here, but because I accept some of the residual advantages that might exist, and Joanna obviously can provide the expert discussion on that. But because of the inconclusive evidence and lack of studies and data on trans athletes, I feel that it's unfair to exclude on that basis, because there's simply insufficient data on this. And even within the cis female category, there are a number of variations between women and men as well. So if we're so hung up on bone density, lung capacity, structure, height, then what are we going to categorize all of those traits? I think we're pushing the division too far, in my opinion.
So I would suggest that the idea of a level playing field is illusory. We don't ever really have a level playing field in sport. However, when we subdivide sport into categories, we do so with an acknowledgement that we're subdividing sport because we can't have meaningful sport for people in these subcategories without doing so. Certainly in combat sports, if we have to subdivide, or little boxers stand no chance against big boxers. But on the other hand, we have groups of athletes with advantages competing against groups of athletes with disadvantages. And the most obvious thing is left-handed athletes versus right-handed athletes. In many sports, left-handed athletes are advantaged. Fencing is perhaps the most obvious. 40% of the world's elite fencers are left-handed. 10% of the population is. So, but the advantages that left-handers have are not so great that right-handers can't win. And so that's the key point when we subdivide. If we subdivide sports into men's and women's categories, we do so at high levels of sport, because women can't win anything of importance in most sports if they have to compete against men. Now, what happens if cisgender women have to compete against transgender women? Transgender women will have some physical characteristics that will be carried over from the legacy effect, but they'll have some that won't. And exactly how these two groups compete against one another is uncertain to say scientifically, but certainly if we look at representation, trans women are still hugely underrepresented. Trans women make up roughly 1% of all women. And so theoretically, we should have 1% of all female athletes be transgender, but it's far, far smaller than that. And so this idea that there's this big threat from trans women isn't true. But beyond that, the idea that there can't be meaningful competition between these two groups because of some carryover advantages doesn't hold up if one looks at population studies.
Just to follow that up with another question from the audience, what do you mean by meaningful to whom? When you say meaningful competition or meaningful...
As I said in the example, left-handed fencers and right-handed fencers have meaningful competition. The chances of winning aren't equal for right-handers and left-handers, but right-handers can win, even though they are somewhat disadvantaged. A little boxer has no chance to beat a big boxer, zero. I mean, absolutely zero chance. So there's no meaningful competition between little boxers and big boxers. And so in a biological sense, and I'm borrowing this from a book by Thomas Murray called Good Sport, and he goes into a lot more detail, but if you're looking at biological variations, if the biological variations are only one of a number of factors that lead to success, then you do have meaningful competition. If the biological differences between people who are competing overwhelm the things we want to measure in sports, things like courage and training and heart and athleticism, then we don't have meaningful competition.
I think that left-handed, right-handed is a really interesting example. What book was that, Joanna? Did you?
Good Sport is the name of it. Thomas Murray is the author.
Murray, I have to read that. I think that's really interesting. And just to touch on what Joanna said, also though, if you look at the boxing example, for instance, and you have weight divisions, there are boxers that jump up weight divisions and compete in meaningful sport. So you have those exceptions sometimes. So sometimes categories are shifted and changed, because there are those moments in sport where you have differences actually coming together and competition working successfully. And then I think in golf there's been a lot of development with men and women competing together in competition as well, and women doing exceptionally well against men, and so questioning those boundaries between some of the sports.
I think in some sports there's very marginal or no difference, right? Like in archery or shooting, there's not much difference between male and female.
Yeah, the percentage difference varies quite a bit by sport. In athletics, it's 10 to 12%. In weightlifting, it's more like 50%. But in archery, the difference between male and female archers is 2%. So, it's a very, very minor, and in shooting, it's even less. So, and then there's equestrian, where men and women compete against one another, of course, on horses, but, the difference in male and female sport accomplishments are, very much dependent on the sport.
Then doesn't it make sense to leave it to the governing bodies of those sports to decide how to proceed?
I am in theory in favor of letting individual sports make policy. However, I think, what we've seen in the last year, hasn't all worked out that well in practice, because, we have individual sports going off in very different directions, and it has created, wave after wave of controversy, regardless of how the sports governing bodies have made their decisions. So I have to admit, a few years ago, I was saying absolutely sports should be making their own. And now I'm maybe saying that there may be, some more guidance from the IOC might have been helpful. But anyway.
From my perspective.
I think there's one. Oh, sorry. No,
I was just going to say, from my perspective, I think the governing bodies are displaying that there needs to be some more compliance in how they're drawing their policies, and I think there's got to be a responsibility there. So from a legal and regulatory point of view, there's got to be more of a framework of how they're drawing these policies together, because yes, every sport will have expertise in what's best for their own sport, but at the same time, have they got expertise in what's best for their athletes in terms of their welfare, their well-being, their rights? I don't think they do. They're definitely not there yet. And so that's why I think it needs some other intervention or guidance. But intervention shouldn't be a negative thing. Good governance can be positive to assist governing bodies with framing their policies.
So I think there's a related question. Can the new FINA policy, which effectively bans all trans athletic participation, given its strict nature, be said to comply with the latest IOC guidance and with general anti-discrimination law?
Well, it speaks about the IOC framework and it uses the IOC framework as a foundation for what it's created, I think, or justifying the policy that it's created. But I personally don't think it has dealt with inclusion. I think in the policy they talk about the criticisms of the IOC framework and medical associations criticising the over focus on inclusion, and then they followed that with their policy. So I don't think they've really considered the IOC policy in the IOC guidance, sorry, in my opinion. In terms of anti-discrimination laws, well, these eligibility policies are by their very nature exclusionary, and Cass have said that in Duty Chand and Semenya, but it's whether they're reasonable and proportionate. And from my point of view, I don't believe they are reasonable and proportionate as long as the evidence is insufficient and inconclusive. I don't think there's that proportionality or that reasonableness there. But Joanna's perspective might be different.
I pretty much agree with you, but so right now, the FINA policy doesn't actually ban anyone because there's no international level transgender swimmers. But if USA Swimming adopts it, and they very well might, then we have a high profile case of a swimmer who would be banned. And if USA Swimming adopts this, I would not be surprised at all if Leah Thomas enlists the assistance of some high-powered legal help and takes the case to CAS. And I guess if that happens, we'll see. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's highly questionable whether the FINA policy would survive a CAS review, but who knows for sure.
Has your view changed since you started studying this? Did you have certain assumptions earlier which have evolved over time, or have you maintained, the same view on this throughout?
No, I've definitely, a lot of my opinions have evolved. A lot of the things that, that I thought I would see, I didn't see. And yeah, I'm surprised at things I see regularly. Even if I have spent more time over the past 10 years looking at trans athletes than anyone else in the world, I know maybe a tenth of what I think I should know. And so as somebody who believes that my opinion should follow the data, my opinions have changed too. I hope that, I can continue to study and learn and grow over the next several years.
There are a couple of more questions. Sorry, Seema, you wanted to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to add to that if you wanted me to. Just add my
opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with Joanna. My views are always changing. As I said, I've spent 20 years on this topic from the legal regulatory point of view. And if we don't evolve with our views and our perspectives, then we don't move forward. And so you will have the likes of myself and Joanna having those reasoned judgments and views on this, but we're now up against, unfortunately, the public view, which isn't as open and evolving and understanding, so to speak. And I think that's what's created the problem here. Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, made a comment about participation of trans athletes and policies, but it was uninformed. And that is creating this polarisation, I think.
Boris Johnson would make an uninformed opinion? That doesn't seem like him at all, right?
There's a question here on how much of the negative feelings of cisgender female athletes towards the participation of trans women athletes, which they see as unfair, matter to the discussion. I think we touched on this a little, but if anyone wants to take that on.
The feelings of who? Sorry, the feelings.
Cisgender athletes, cisgender women athletes.
Oh, it's key. All views are key to this. Not one view is more important than the other. I said this earlier on in the debate that cis females have been pitted against trans female athletes. I think that's incredibly wrong, because there is not them against, them shouldn't be against each other. We're trying to understand how participation can work together and inclusively, rather than a war, basically, which has been created. So the feelings of cis females are incredibly important. But what I would say is, we need to understand where the feelings have come from in terms of their fear or feeling threatened, and maybe provide education for them to understand that perhaps those feelings have been threatened, or they're going to lose their place in sport, are not necessarily true, and that's not going to be the case at all because of the situation. But absolutely, all those rights are just as important as each other.
And I agree with everything Seema said, but I would also suggest that, there seems to be this suggestion that all cis female athletes are opposed to trans athletes. And that's not true at all. I was, several months ago, I was on a podcast with 4 world-class female athletes. And all of them were probably more in terms of this inclusion versus science sort of thing, they were all probably more towards the inclusion of trans athletes than I was. And so it was this very unusual podcast where, they were all for, making sports as inclusive as possible for trans athletes. And I kind of had to be the other voice saying, yeah, but, there is some science. And so, the idea that all cis female athletes are opposed to trans is not true. And, a lot of the current athletes on both sides of this don't want to speak up because they just don't, they want to concentrate on their sport and they don't want to get caught up in all this controversy.
I think it's a question at the moment of who is speaking loudest.
Yes.
In the media, isn't it? And you've got some very specific personalities or celebrities in the sporting world who are speaking the loudest and being very vocal about it. And so that's then been used as an assumption, well, then that's the view of all of that group.
When you also have prominent trans athletes like, say, Caitlyn Jenner, or even Renee Richards later said, right, that she wouldn't have taken the stand that she did. Maybe that also skews the public view on this.
What did she say? Sorry, Bhavya, I didn't hear that bit.
Renee Richards later said, after she won her case, if I'm not mistaken, she said that if I had transitioned earlier and played against cis women earlier, I would have beaten them all. Now, I don't know if she would or would not, but when a prominent athlete like that speaks against inclusion, it would make it seem that in the public eye that there is an unfair advantage, right?
Well, I wasn't aware she said that, because in her legal case, when she brought the case to the Supreme Court, she had experts that testified that she had more of a disadvantage when she competed than an advantage, including medical experts as well that were a close part of her case. So yeah, it's interesting that she said that. And I think with the case,
it was 20 years later, so it was 20, maybe even 25 years after she won her case, maybe 30, that she came out and said, no, in retrospect, and so it was much later in life that Renee did that.
That's interesting. But with Caitlyn Jenner, obviously she transitioned after she had as a retired athlete.
And Caitlyn Jenner did compete in at least one women's golf tournament. So again, the idea, that trans women shouldn't be competing, but Caitlyn's a pretty good golfer and has competed against other women on the links, and so. Yeah, I within any subgroup, whether it's cis athletes or trans athletes, you will find a variety of viewpoints, and that's always true. But I would suggest that the number of athletic trans women who think that trans women shouldn't be competing in high-level women's sports is easily outnumbered by the number of trans women who think that we should be allowed in.
But with your more measured view or not very strident view, do you get a lot of backlash, or what are the kind of responses you face?
Sure, it is kind of interesting. I get hate mail from people who say I'm destroying women's sports, but I also get hate mail because I favor some restricted hate mail from trans activists too, saying I'm a traitor to trans people. So, yeah, I get backlash from all kinds of people, but it's just 2 buttons to delete and block.
Yes, I did recently as well get some negative comments, but I think they actually opened up the debate even more. One said, why am I talking about law and human rights? It has nothing to do with sport. And I thought that's very telling, because that's what sports law debate is all about. So, again, it's back to what I said. It's like, if you want to debate about this and talk about this, it's got to come from a reasoned, informed position, respectful and open to debate, rather than kind of a very narrow-minded view on this, I think.
We have one last question. Do you think that 50 years from now, if women, whether cis or trans, are given equal opportunity in training and money, etc., the gap between the men's and the women's category winners will reduce, and eventually we will have one inclusive category?
Go ahead, Seema, you can speak first.
No, I don't know how to. You go first. I can't. That's a big question.
So, I think that in most sports, there will remain a very substantial gap, regardless of how well women's sports are supported. I think that, is there a gap that will be closed? Yes. But I think certainly at the top end, especially, there will be a much, I don't think that the gaps will close very much. But if you look at the depth in men's sport versus the depth in women's sports, it speaks to all of the inequities that female athletes have to face. And so I certainly hope that 50 years from now, women's sports is more highly valued, more highly funded, and women professional athletes are paid better, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that will be to the benefit of all athletes. But I think we're still going to need a women's category and a men's category in most sports.
What do I think? I think that I hope in that period of time there would be a much more fluid and open perspective of men and women categories, and I think that will happen. I think sport will have to catch up as society does develop in this area. And again, not an expert in the science, but my understanding of men and women's differences are that there's significant progress with women's sport, and in some sports there's a bit of a kind of a plateau in men's acceleration of performance, where women are catching up a little bit. But I understand that the science suggests there will always be that difference in many of the sports, but not to say in all the sports. So I think golf, for instance, is a really interesting one with men and women competing together. I'm really excited to see what happens there actually in the future.
Seema, just to say that they don't hit from the same tees.
No, but then there was a discussion about that in that competition that I meant, that in the mixed competition, that actually if she had hit from the male tee, she still would have done, this one particular golfer would still done really, really well. So and that it wouldn't have made too much of a difference because of the technique and skill that's required in putting and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot more complexity to that sport than just the tee situation, I think. But I'd like to think that in the time going forward, there would be more mixed gender sports opportunities as well as we progress.
And I would echo that. I think, but I do think, especially at recreational levels of sport, we should look beyond male and female categories, and we should, there are all sorts of creative things that can be done to separate or not separate athletes. And we're moving towards a non-binary world. And, I think that sports will have to reflect that in future. But as I say, I don't see the biological differences between elite male and elite female athletes getting small enough where we can get away with the female category in things like Olympics or professional sports, anytime in the near future.
We're out of questions and also out of time. So thank you both so much. I'll hand it back to Roshan today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Joanna, Seema, and Bhavya, for this really insightful discussion. I think you've given us plenty of perspective. Thank you so much to all our viewers as well for tuning in this evening. This brings us to the end of the session, and we look forward to hosting you all again very soon. Have a good evening. Bye.